Okay, so let's talk about something probably everyone listening dreams about. Seeing the world. Maybe it's just a quick getaway, or maybe it's a big multi-month adventure, maybe even a whole year, just exploring.
Right. The big dream.
But for so many of us, the biggest question, the real hurdle, isn't where you want to go. It's,
Yeah.
well, how do you possibly afford it?
Exactly. And, if you actually look at where the money goes on most trips, two things usually jump out.
Hmm.
Getting there and getting around, that's your transportation, and then having a roof over your head each night, your accommodation.
Yeah, those are the big ones. They can absolutely destroy a budget if you're not careful.
They really can. The biggest budget busters, often by a long shot.
So our mission today, what we're doing here, is diving deep into this whole collection of sources you sent over. We've got articles, some research, even like really candid personal stories and stuff from online forums.
Yeah, a real mix.
And we're going to sift through all of it, try to pull out the most potent, the most actionable, and maybe even some surprising tips for making those big global adventures much, much more budget-friendly.
Think of it as like a shortcut. You get the distilled wisdom on how people really manage to travel without emptying their bank accounts.
Exactly. A fast track to figuring this stuff out.
And we looked at a pretty wide spectrum, didn't we? Everything from, seasoned travel bloggers who've been doing this for years to financial advice sites breaking down actual costs.
And those raw conversations you find on travel forums,
Yeah.
which could be super insightful.
Totally. Plus, things like that timeout study that actually crunched numbers on average daily spending in different countries. So
Yeah.
it gives you like a really rich picture from different angles.
They would jump right in then. There's this concept that pops up in a few sources, almost like an extreme benchmark, especially if you're thinking long-term travel. It's the idea of living and traveling on something like, what, $20 a day?
Yeah, that figure. Or something really close, like maybe $600 a month, which works out to $7,200 for a whole year. It definitely comes up.
Wow.
It represents a pretty significant level of frugality, let's say. It's definitely aiming for the shoestring end of things.
And the descriptions of how people actually pull that off are pretty intense.
Oh, yeah.
One source mentions eating super simply, like bread and avocado, maybe some fruit, pasta dinners. Another talks about street food in parts of Asia where you can get a meal for under $1.
Right. And a crucial point that multiple sources highlight is that hitting that kind of low daily number almost always means cutting out major expenses, like nightlife and heavy partying.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense.
One source explicitly called it the biggest budget eater,
Right?
said it could cost thousands over the course of a trip if you're not careful.
Right. It's not just the drinks, it's the whole scene, right?
Yeah.
Late night taxis, maybe impulse buys.
Exactly. And then there's accommodation. At that $20 a day level, you're looking at the absolute basics.
Like what?
Well, camping is one. Or those famously cheap $2 a night basic hotels you might find in parts of Asia. Maybe hostels for around €5 in Eastern Europe. Or like $6 for a hostel bed in India. Super basic stuff.
But it sounds like the sources frame this less as a typical 2-week vacation budget and more as a lifestyle choice.
That's a really key distinction, yeah.
Ah.
They mostly describe this as the kind of budget you need for a long-term travel lifestyle, not your average holiday.
Mm-hmm. That Reddit discussion you shared was interesting on this. It really tried to draw a line between being genuinely frugal, smart with money, and just being cheap. Or, as one person bluntly put it, living like a bum.
Yeah, it highlighted that traveling this way often means you have to accept some pretty big trade-offs.
Like what kind of trade-offs?
Well, potential discomfort, for one. Maybe places that aren't perfectly clean, sharing bathrooms, relying more on serendipity or just luck rather than guaranteed comfort. And it demands a totally different relationship with time. To save money on transport, you might choose a 2-day bus journey instead of hopping on a 2-hour flight.
Right, which you just can't do if you only have 2 weeks off work.
Exactly. It needs huge time flexibility. And it also means you're constantly making choices, maybe skipping paid attractions or experiences because they'd blow that tight daily budget.
And I guess the elephant in the room is where you are. Achieving this kind of budget must be massively dependent on the destination, right?
Oh, absolutely. The sources were unanimous on that. It's far, far easier in places like Southeast Asia or parts of South America, maybe Eastern Europe compared to, say, the US, Canada, or Western Europe. Forget about $20 a day there.
Right.
That timeout study you mentioned really drove this home. It named Laos as the cheapest country they looked at. With an average daily spend now, this excludes the flight to get there of just $16 US.
$16. Wow.
Yeah. And other places on that super low-cost list include Kazakhstan and Rwanda. It's just a powerful reminder that maybe the first and biggest budget decision you make is simply where you decide to go. Your money just stretches way further in some places.
Okay, okay. So let's maybe take a breath from that super extreme $20 a day idea and pivot. Let's talk about more practical, actionable strategies that came up in the sources for cutting costs, specifically on transportation. Both getting to your destination and then moving around once you're actually there.
Sure. Okay, flights first. The absolute fundamental advice, and this was repeated pretty much everywhere, is plan ahead. Like, think months in advance.
Right.
And be flexible with your travel dates. Prices can swing wildly depending on the day of the week, the season, even the time of day you fly.
So it's not necessarily like book exactly X months out, is it? It
Yeah.
sounds more like you need to watch the prices.
Exactly. The sources show it varies so much by route. It's more about being diligent with price tracking, using those flight comparison websites and apps, setting up price alerts. Those are your best tools.
Using those flexible date search things too.
Yes, those are key for finding cheaper combinations. And another tip, if you're planning to visit multiple places, maybe looking to multi-stop tickets or even round-the-world fares. Sometimes bundling flights like that can be cheaper than buying a bunch of separate one-ways.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about once you're actually in a region? How do you save money moving around locally?
Well, the sources really push for prioritizing alternatives to flying for those shorter distances.
Well, trains and buses?
Yeah, buses, trains, ferries, they're almost always cheaper. But the insight here is that they also give you a totally different, sometimes much richer travel experience. You actually see the landscape change. You might interact more with locals. It's just different.
Mm-hmm. And within cities, what's the advice there? Taxis are expensive.
Oh, definitely. The message is loud and clear. Use the local public transit. Buses, trams, subways, whatever they have. Not only is it way cheaper than taxis or rideshares like Uber, but, you're paying the local price. You're experiencing the city like a resident. And hey, if you get lost, there are actual people around you can ask for directions.
Good point. And what about those travel passes?
Yeah, definitely look into those. Researching and maybe buying a multi-day transportation pass can be really smart if you plan on exploring a city quite a bit. You get unlimited rides for a fixed price, which often works out cheaper than buying single tickets all the time.
Okay. Now, there was a tip that seemed particularly relevant for certain parts of the world. Something about negotiating fares?
Ah, yes. Especially thinking about taxis or like tuk-tuks in some countries in Asia or Africa. The advice is to politely but firmly agree on the fare before you start the journey.
So you don't get ripped off at the end.
Exactly. But this means you need to do a little homework first, right? Try to find out what a typical local fare should be so you have a baseline.
Gotcha. What about longer distances but still overland?
Ride-sharing or carpooling is worth looking into. Platforms like BlaBlaCar or even hitchhikers.org connect you with drivers already going your way. You basically just chip in for gas, which is usually much less than a bus or train ticket.
Interesting. Okay.
And seriously, don't underestimate walking.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the ultimate budget option.
It's totally free. Plus, it's often the best way to just stumble upon hidden gems, little side streets, cool cafes, and it keeps you active. It's a win-win-win.
True. There was one other little practical tip about local transport.
Mm-hmm.
Something about hostels.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah, some experienced travelers mentioned that sometimes booking your local bus or ferry ticket through your hostel can actually be a good move.
really? Why is that?
Well, hostels often work with reputable local companies who value that relationship, so they might help ensure you get a fair price and aren't getting scammed by some random operator on the street. Worth asking. Anyway.
Okay, interesting. So we've covered getting around. Now let's tackle the other big chunk of the budget puzzle, accommodation. Finding a place to sleep. Beyond those extreme $2 a night rooms we talked about earlier, the sources seem to offer a whole range of creative and budget-friendly options, right?
Yeah.
Some cheap, some maybe even free.
Absolutely. Starting with the more, let's say, traditional budget options, you've got camping. Classic. Requires minimal gear, pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are hostels, and the key thing here, maybe especially for listeners who haven't stayed in one since they were like 20,
Yeah.
is that hostels have really evolved. They're not just dorm rooms packed with teenagers anymore. Many cater to a much wider age range. They often have private rooms available.
Oh.
And crucially, almost all of them have that shared kitchen.
The kitchen. That seems like a big money saver.
Huge. For solo travelers, yeah, dorms are the absolute cheapest way to go, and they're great for meeting people. But even if you're traveling with friends, maybe you can rent out a whole small dorm room. And that shared kitchen, honestly, it's gold. Being able to just buy groceries at a local market and cook some of your own meals, it saves a fortune compared to eating out 3 times a day. Plus, it's a really natural place to socialize and swap tips with other travelers.
But are all hostels basically the same?
No, definitely not. The sources acknowledge that. Some can be really basic, maybe a bit rough around the edges. And then you have these like hip boutique hostels that can actually be surprisingly expensive.
Okay.
The point is sometimes paying a little bit more, maybe, $5 instead of $3 for a bed for a place that has consistently better reviews for cleanliness or location or security. That small extra cost is often absolutely worth it for your overall comfort and peace of mind.
Makes sense. So beyond hostels, what else is in that sort of cheap but not free category?
Well, basic cheap hotels and guest houses definitely exist, especially in those lower cost countries we talked about.
Right.
One really good tip we saw was to look for smaller, maybe family-run places that are slightly outside the main tourist drag. And instead of booking through a big online platform, try contacting them directly, maybe via email. Sometimes you can get a better local rate that way.
Interesting. Okay. And what about things like Airbnb, short-term rentals?
Yeah, those offer a different kind of value proposition, according to the sources. Renting a room in someone's apartment or even getting a whole place to yourself gives you more home comforts.
Right. You feel a bit more like you're living there.
Exactly. And you often get a glimpse into more local life. But the primary budget advantage that the sources highlighted, again, comes back to the kitchen.
Having your own kitchen access.
Yes, being able to shop locally, cook your own food, that dramatically cuts down on restaurant costs. Plus, you often get other amenities like a washing machine, maybe more reliable Wi-Fi.
So the nightly price might look similar to a budget hotel, but the kitchen savings add up.
Precisely, that's the value calculation.
Yeah.
But there's a crucial warning that came up repeatedly in the sources regarding these rentals.
Okay, what's that?
You have to vet the listing really carefully. Don't just look at the star rating. Read the reviews, and specifically look for multiple negative reviews, not just one disgruntled person. Apparently, some hosts can be quite manipulative with ratings.
Ah, good to know.
And the other big one, always keep all your communication and especially your payments on the platform itself. If a host tries to get you to communicate or pay outside of Airbnb or whatever site you're using, that's a massive red flag. Huge potential for scams.
Right. Keep it official.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting, where the sources seem to push the boundaries of budget travel. The idea of finding free places to stay or maybe trading something for accommodation.
Yeah, this whole area of work trade or hospitality exchange, it's basically the concept of exchanging your time, maybe your skills, or even just your presence and willingness to connect for a place to sleep.
So what forms does that take?
Well, one big category is volunteering in exchange for room and sometimes board. There are popular platforms that connect travelers with hosts who need help with something.
Like what kind of help?
Oh, all sorts. It could be working on a farm or in a garden. That's what WWOF, Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, specifically focuses on. Or it could be helping out in a hostel, maybe some light construction, teaching English, even childcare sometimes.
Okay. And there are websites for this.
Yep. Platforms like Workaway, HelpX, Worldpackers are some of the big ones mentioned. Most of them charge a small annual fee to join, but the sources point out that even just saving on a few nights accommodation can easily make that fee worthwhile.
Interesting. Is it better value in some places than others?
That's a good point. One insight was that using Work Exchange might actually give you more significant savings in, say, expensive developed countries. Think Western Europe, Australia, North America, where even basic accommodation costs a lot.
Yeah.
Compared to maybe Southeast Asia, where you can already find super cheap guest houses anyway.
All right, the relative savings bigger.
Here.
Okay. What else is in this free stay category?
House sitting is another popular route. Basically, you look after someone's home, and often their pets, while they're away on vacation. In return, you get to stay in their house for free.
Sounds pretty ideal.
It does, right? Sites like Trusted House Sitters and House Carers were mentioned as leaders in this space, but the sources warn that it sounds easier than it is.
How so?
The competition for good house sits, especially in desirable locations or for longer periods, can be really fierce. You need to build a strong profile, get good references, be professional in your applications. You might have to apply for a lot of them before you land one.
Ah, okay. So it takes effort.
Definitely. But the payoff, having a comfortable home all to yourself, usually with all the amenities, totally free, can be huge if you manage it.
Okay. And then there's Couchsurfing and similar things.
Right. Hospitality exchanges like Couchsurfing or Be Welcome, these are platforms where the core idea is offering a free place to stay. Maybe literally a couch, maybe a spare room, primarily for the purpose of cultural exchange and connection. It's not meant to be just a free hotel.
So there's an expectation of interacting with your host.
Absolutely. And the sources lay out a clear etiquette for being a good guest. Don't overstay your welcome. Maybe bring a small, thoughtful gift from your home country, offer to help out with chores or cooking, and always clean up after yourself. Basically, be respectful of your host and their home.
Makes sense. Now, the sources also mentioned a less positive side to some of these platforms, something about people misusing them.
Yes, unfortunately. They didn't shy away from discussing what's sometimes called the sex secret, particularly around couch surfing. The reality is that some individuals, both hosts and surfers, do try to use these platforms primarily for finding casual hookups, which isn't the intended purpose.
Right. So how do you navigate that if you're just looking for genuine cultural exchange?
The advice isn't necessarily to avoid these platforms altogether, but to be extremely selective and vigilant. Really scrutinize profiles.
Like, what should you look for?
Look for hosts or guests who have fully completed profiles, not just a sentence or two. Check for multiple positive reviews or testimonials, ideally from a diverse range of people. See if you genuinely share common interests mentioned in their profile.
Okay.
And maybe consider staying with families or same-sex hosts or people in a different age bracket if that makes you feel more comfortable. Crucially, be very clear in your own communication from the outset that you're seeking a purely platonic cultural exchange experience.
Got it. Be upfront and careful.
Exactly. And some sources mention there are even dedicated communities or groups specifically for female travelers using these exchanges, which can add another layer of vetting and support.
Okay. Wow. And there was one really unusual option mentioned too, something about convents.
Oh, yeah, that was fascinating. It came from a Reddit thread example. Someone suggested contacting local Catholic archdioceses or even convents in certain cities. Apparently, some religious facilities occasionally offer very basic, minimal cost lodging. Yeah, though it likely comes with strict rules like curfews or codes of conduct. But it's just a great reminder to think creatively, ask around, use local networks. You never know what might be available.
That's wild. Okay, so pulling all these different threads together from that extreme $20 a day idea through all the specific tips on transport and the huge range of accommodation options, what's the sort of overarching mindset? What are the key practical takeaways from the sources that define successful budget travel?
Well, first and foremost, and this came up again and again, research. Deep research before you even leave home. Not just glancing at average destination costs, but really digging into the specifics. What are the cheap transport options there? What kind of work exchange or hostel situations exist in that city?
So homework is essential.
Absolutely. And then there's food. Eating local, especially trying street food, was repeatedly highlighted, not just because it's usually the cheapest option, but often it's the most delicious and gives you a real taste of the local culture.
And using grocery stores too.
Definitely. Supplementing street food or cheap eats with buying some basics at a grocery store or market to make your own breakfasts or lunches is a critical budget strategy. Saves a ton.
Okay. And we mentioned this earlier, but it seems worth repeating because the impact sounds massive.
But the alcohol and partying.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sources really emphasize that cutting way back on or even eliminating alcohol and frequent big nights out is probably the single biggest lever you can pull to free up significant travel funds. We're talking potentially thousands of dollars saved over a longer trip.
Yeah. Okay. What about practical money stuff, like managing cash?
Yeah, a really solid practical tip that came up in several places was about banking fees, specifically finding and using a debit card that, one, doesn't charge foreign transaction fees every time you buy something abroad, and two, actually refunds any ATM fees you get charged by other banks worldwide.
Oh, that's smart. Are there specific ones?
Charles Schwab was mentioned by name in some U.S.-based sources as offering a card like this, but the principle applies globally. Look for banks in your country that offer traveler-friendly accounts like that. It stops you from just bleeding money on fees.
Good tip.
Okay.
I think it boils down to that blend of planning and flexibility we touched on earlier.
Right.
You need the planning to identify the opportunities, set a rough budget, do that research, but you also need the flexibility to maybe grab a last-minute cheap flight deal or adapt if your Couchsurfing host cancels, or even just decide to stay longer in one place because you love it, and moving slower inherently saves money.
Yeah. Constantly moving is expensive.
It really is.
Yeah.
Staying put for a bit longer cuts down on those constant transport and new accommodation costs.
And finally, I guess, safety, especially with some of these more unconventional options. Cannot be stressed enough. Using common sense is paramount, especially if you're doing things like couch surfing or work exchanges where you're relying on individuals, vetting hosts or opportunities carefully, trusting your gut instinct, letting someone back home know your plans, and always prioritizing your personal safety above saving a few dollars. That's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, non-negotiable. Okay,
Mm.
so wrapping this all up, what's the big picture takeaway for you, for the listener, from this deep dive?
I think the clearest message is that saving significant money on travel, even making long-term travel possible on a tight budget, is way more achievable than a lot of people probably think.
It's not some secret magic trick.
No, not at all. It really seems to be a combination of things, like
Yeah.
that diligent planning we talked about, having strategic flexibility, making conscious and sometimes, unconventional choices about how you travel and where you sleep.
And being genuinely open to experiences that maybe fall outside the typical tourist comfort zone, like living with a local family for a few days or trading a few hours of work for your bed.
Exactly. It's about embracing those alternatives.
And the sources suggest this isn't just about like depriving yourself for the sake of being cheap, right? It's more strategic than that.
Right. It's framed as using these methods as tools. Tools that enable you to travel more often or travel for longer periods or maybe experience a place on a much deeper, more authentic level than you would if you just stayed in a standard hotel and took taxis everywhere.
It sort of shifts the focus, doesn't it? From just like buying a prepackaged travel product.
To actively participating more, engaging with a place, maybe with a global community, trading skills or cultural exchange right alongside your currency. It's a different way to approach it.
Yeah, a different mindset entirely. Which I guess leaves us with something to think about maybe as you start planning your next adventure. Given this huge range of proven strategies we've just talked about, all these ways to seriously cut costs on the road, from booking flights smarter and using local buses to living with hosts or house sitting for free, is the biggest barrier stopping most people from exploring the world really a lack of money? Or is it maybe just our own reluctance sometimes to step outside that familiar comfort zone?